Hello and welcome to Skipped History. I'm joined today by Donovan X. Ramsey, a journalist and author. Donovan's reporting has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, GQ, WSJ Magazine, Ebony, and Essence, among other outlets. He has been a staff reporter at the Los Angeles Times, News One, and The Griot. He has also served as an editor at the Marshall Project and Complex. Most recently, Donovan is the author of When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era, which explores the history of the crack epidemic, and is the subject of our conversation today. Donovan, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Ben. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Truly my pleasure. I know I was saying this a bit before, but your book is the kind of book that will linger with me for a long time. It's really the way that you intersperse reporting on the history of the war on drugs and the rise of the crack epidemic with the lives of four specific people affected by it is really such I think, a genius way to write about this history, and using the history almost as the fifth character in the book that kind of manipulates the history of in the lives of the other people you focus on and their stories and the way you capture them. It's really a stunning achievement. So congratulations and thank you again for your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, even if I begrudge you a lot of time for owe me a lot of time that I spent with my hands, my head in my hands, and walking through the park, trying not to cry. But let's begin. Let's start to ground our conversation. Let's begin with the start of the war on drugs. Even though I'll add that you do some really important contextualizing of drug policy going back to the early 1900s and how Black Americans have been villainized and stereotyped as in relation to drug policy and drug use over the years. Dating back to that time. But anyway, how did the Nixon administration respond to the civil disobedience of the 60s by launching a full-fledged war on drugs? And how did that war lead to disinvestment in cities?
You know, we think of the war on drugs as Ronald Reagan, maybe Bill Clinton in the 94 crime bill, but the war on drugs really begins in earnest under Richard Nixon. It comes about really for political reasons that his political opponents he saw as the anti-war left and radical groups like the Black Panthers. And a way of targeting those groups, his administration decided that the best way to do that would be through drug policy, going after possession of drugs like marijuana and heroin that were, and also, hallucinogenics that were associated with the left. So that was something that was talked about explicitly in his administration. And when he launched the war on drugs, that was the original direction. Nixon was not able to take his war on drugs to its ultimate end because he resigned from the presidency in shame after Watergate. But politicians on both sides of the aisle would take up the war on drugs in years to come.
And can you talk a little bit about part of the war on drugs is, maybe can you talk a bit about some of the general policy side of the war on drugs, like investment in law enforcement, kind of what that approach is?
Absolutely. So, when we talk about the war on drugs, it can kind of seem like this vague thing, but the way that it came together on the policy side was both the creation of dedicated agencies like the DEA, which came together slowly, that focused their efforts entirely on figuring out how to create a drug-free America. And as early as Richard Nixon, the U.S. government put a big focus on drug possession domestically and not interdiction, which was a policy of actually stemming the flow of drugs into the United States.
Right.
So, that was one dedicated policy decision. But when you talk about how that breaks down, we're looking at increased policing. We're looking at new laws that actually criminalize substances, putting substances on a schedule. So classifications of drugs that make them that increased penalties based on their supposed addictiveness and potential for harm. That all of this is a part of the early war on drugs that we see under Nixon. As it continues, that it sort of escalates in increasingly draconian drug policy, and that is under Reagan, but also the Clinton administration.
Right, and you detail the different administrations kind of. Each one amps up the efforts of the other, spending more and more money. We'll get into that a little bit, but it generally seems a lot like, as you're alluding, there's some root causes here. There's the root cause of drugs coming into the country, and then there's also the root cause of spending lots of money on drug law enforcement, like you're saying, without spending much after LBJ, without spending much on building up the infrastructure of the communities that are most impacted by drug proliferation, whether that be schools or whether that be investing in job assistance or whether that be housing, which then also lays some of the conditions for the epidemic to arise. Can you talk a little bit about how in the entering the 80s, the drugs of the crack epidemic began to proliferate? And maybe just to get us into that, you can talk about, maybe you can help explain what freebase is, and then also what crack is, and how Ricky Ross pioneered this idea of Ready Rock.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let me set the scene for you.
Please.
I would say that, like the 1980s were a period of major disinvestment in the United States. Reagan said it was morning in America, and that was this extreme sort of conservative shift towards free markets, towards private industry. So less and less investment from the federal government into cities. And then you also see cities start to struggle as their population shift. Towards the 70s and the 80s, there is huge white flight from cities that had been industrial hubs as folks move to the suburbs. There again, with deindustrialization, you see fewer and fewer high-paying jobs for skilled workers. So the situation going into the 1980s is that major cities across the country had become ghettos, essentially. That they were places for poor people, often people of color, where there were fewer and fewer opportunities and increasing disaffection. And that was something that I didn't realize going into writing the book. I was born in 1987, so I more or less missed the 80s. But what I discovered is that the kind of despair that we talk about today in the Rust Belt or in coal country or places in rural America where people are, that they feel isolated and without sort of access to the, whole of American life, that was the case in cities, in communities of color in the 1980s. So that sets the stage for something like the crack epidemic. So, towards actually talking about the substance, we have to remember that in the 70s, cocaine had been this glamour drug. It was something that was really normalized. It wasn't a scary thing. A lot of people experimented with cocaine. It was a part of the lifestyle of the 70s.
And who was the I'm forgetting it now, but who's the old scientist who talks about, who you mentioned, who says in the 1880s, who's talking about cocaine?
Well, there's Sigmund Freud, right?
There's Freud. Freud is talking about cocaine.
Yeah. Freud is one of the earliest cocaine enthusiasts when sort of powder cocaine becomes popular in the early 1900s is when it really hit its peak. But he actually published a paper called Uber Cocaine, praising it as a wonder drug, and he was a pretty hardcore cocaine addict for a period of time and had to go into recovery. But many people, scientists, doctors, praise the benefits of cocaine as a stimulant. So, that kind of enthusiasm for cocaine extends into the 70s and the disco era and all the experimentation of the 1960s and 70s. So going into the 80s, there wasn't a lot of fear of cocaine. And according to my reporting, I spent a year traveling across the country to the hardest hit cities, interviewing people about the crack epidemic. I kept getting stories from people in LA about a local pimp that had connections to the Bay Area that had really taught a lot of people how to make freebase cocaine, how to make cocaine smokable, therefore some would say more potent, but also cheaper and more accessible. And when I pulled that thread of the pimp with the Bay Area connections, it brought me to a head shop in the Berkeley area. A head shop is a place where people sell drug paraphernalia, bongs, papers, things like that.
To be fair, I feel like if you pull most threads in the Bay Area, they will lead you to a head shop of one form or another.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
So this head shop also was an independent publisher of books about drugs, and they published a book called The Pleasures of Cocaine throughout the 70s and early 80s that included in it a recipe for freebase cocaine. And this book became so popular, and it proliferated the Bay. And apparently, that was how this pimp, who ended up in Los Angeles through his connections to the Bay Area, learned this process. And in Los Angeles, it just found a perfect audience, namely in someone like Rick Ross. So I should probably explain freebasing.
yeah, I'm interested. Yeah, I think you should. I mean, some people who are reading or listening to this might need no explanation at all.
Sure.
But others I assume will. So yeah, and I'm interested too, just in like the origin of the name freebase, because I never thought of that. I never realized that either.
So freebase was the first name for crack cocaine. And it got that name actually from the chemical process by which it's made, which is separating the base of a compound from its other elements. So the base of cocaine from its other elements. And what happens is you take, this is not to tell people how to make crack, right? Like not like specifically,
right.
but there is a substance, right? Yeah. But there's a process by which, the powder cocaine is mixed with other materials and heated. And traditionally it had been volatile materials like ether. And what happens is that a substance floats to the top of this mixture. That substance hardens and that becomes smokable. If you were to try to ignite powder cocaine, you would destroy it. But taking this base from its other elements actually created this crystal that was smokable. And anything smokable goes immediately to the brain, which means that it is a almost instantaneous high, but that high is short-lived. So for people that may have a hard time understanding that, I would compare that to maybe smoking a joint versus eating an edible. So it's the same substance, but if you were to smoke a joint, you would be high pretty quickly. Versus if you ate an edible, you might be sitting around for 30 minutes to an hour saying, I don't think this edible is working. And then, you are, yes, and take more. Yeah. And then you are high for a pretty long time.
Yeah.
So that is an example of how a substance can be experienced differently by just based on how it's consumed. For this reason, people thought that freebase was more addictive than powder cocaine. That was the beginning of the myth that that crack was this super drug. In reality, it was just being experienced differently. So from freebase, people like the Bay Area, LA pimp, figured out how to make the substance without using volatile chemicals like ether, where people were blowing themselves up. That you could actually do it with everyday baking soda and have the same product.
Right.
So
See your
website
for details on the amount of tablespoons.
Yes, right. And that, transitions into the crack era. Once there is, a substance that can be easily made, then it just, takes off like a rocket, first out of LA and then spreading, as most trends do across the country.
Right. It's interesting. You have so many good quotes in your book. But one thing you note is that the wide availability of crack being cheap, of cheap cocaine in the form of crack, pulled people into it who might not have otherwise sold drugs, and its rock bottom price also seduced unexpected users at the same time. And you have, I love this quote where you write, for a black, and apologies for reading your words to you. But you write, for Black and Latino youth in particular, the drug trade and the rise of freebase was an unprecedented economic opportunity. It was as though they'd struck gold in land thought to be barren. To the biggest kingpins grew up in extreme poverty in some of America's most devastated communities. Like generations of Americans before them, these young prospectors were willing to take on extreme risks and skirt the law in pursuit of their fortunes. The advent of freebase was their gold rush, their Homestead Act, their prohibition. Really interesting and characteristically illuminating ways of describing these dynamics and their interplay. And you mentioned the myths that begin to form around crack. And one of the focuses of your book is about media's early coverage of the crack epidemic and how they had some misplaced priorities. Can you talk a little bit more about that, maybe through the lens of the Washington Post's publication of Jimmy's World?
Yeah. So Jimmy's World is one of my favorite unknown stories as a journalist, as a black journalist, as someone that has worked on the Metro desk of a newspaper, that it is, I think, published in 1980. It is the story of a 9-year-old heroin addict from Washington, D.C., who's the product of,
I think he's 8 years old.
Incestuous.
Basically.
He's 8.
He's 8. Just
Jimmy's 8, yes.
No.
So,
Least important
8-year-old
detail.
heroin addict.
Yeah.
Yes. No, but for a kid, a year makes a lot of difference, right?
That's true.
So, that, 8 years old, the product of an incestuous relationship between his grandfather and mother. He lives in a heroin shooting gallery. If he gets too antsy or starts to misbehave, his stepfather shoots him up. All of these gory details about, life for this black child in D.C. The story is written by a black woman named Janet Cook, and it's on the front page of the Washington Post, and it's a absolute scandal when it's published. It turns out, though, that the story was entirely made up, that the editors at the Post elevated really what turned out to be a complete fabrication, ran it with illustrations. Like the whole bit, because it was just a story that they were really eager to tell, it turns out. All of this comes out, though, not because of their great investigative reporting at the Washington Post. It comes out because they actually nominate the story for a Pulitzer Prize.
Right.
And it wins, making Janet Cook the first black woman to win a Pulitzer in a journalism category, and to this day, the only person to ever give a Pulitzer back. She, immediately after it came out, It turned out that not only had she made up Jimmy's world, but she had lied about her background, and some would say pulled the wool over the post's eyes. I think that they were a little happy to have that wool pulled over their eyes. And what it really signifies to me is just how bad the reporting would be on the topic of drugs throughout the crack era. It was, I think, in hindsight, this opportunity to actually take stock of how we were reporting about poor people, communities of color, about addiction. And instead of learning the lesson, we just replicated that kind of reporting. So you see throughout the crack era, media getting it wrong time and time again, not centering the voices of people who were impacted, centering instead, so-called experts and politicians who, were very disconnected from what was happening on the ground. So, we get myths like crack being immediately addictive, deadly. Was one of the things that people said that that you could smoke it once and you would die. That crack was the worst drug that ever existed, and that myth of crack as somehow different from powder cocaine, it's chemically the same substance. That myth then allowed for a lot of villainization and criminalization of people in possession of crack, both users and dealers. So then we get the additional myths of the super predator and the crackhead and the crack baby. These were terms that were, not just street terms. These were terms used by our elected officials to talk about people.
Yes, your discussion of the spread of the term crack baby at the beginning of the book is such a powerful entry into the history. And just for anybody who's unfamiliar, this idea of a crack baby is based on a study in 1985. This is all stuff I learned from your book, by a young neonatologist who published an articles on the effects of cocaine use in pregnancy in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it really created this whole idea that infants exposed to cocaine had really horrible learning disabilities and depression of, quote, interactive behavior and stuff like that as they grew older. But the study was based on a study of just 23 women early on, which is kind of like meeting an alien only meeting the 26 players of a baseball team and concluding that everybody in humanity in the world is good at this game that somehow takes 3 hours to complete. And you also note that the New York Times editorial board has since acknowledged the paper's role in, quote, slandering the unborn, and apologized for that. That's a more recent development. But one thing, just going off of this idea of the crack baby and the mythology that evolves as the epidemic really takes hold, the media in many ways has misplaced priorities, as you say, and doesn't catch that there's an epidemic beginning. And even, you say, stories about so-called crack babies manage to brush past the lives of their mothers. Women users, black women in particular, fell to the absolute lowest rung on the nation's social ladder. Can you talk a little bit about, your book is so illustrative of the effects of the crack epidemic on communities around the country. Can you talk a little bit about its effects on maybe black women in particular? You have a character in your book named Lenny, and because it seems like they were both ignored and vilified at the same time.
I wanted to write this book because of a neighbor that I had growing up, a woman named Michelle, who I never met, but she was the talk of the neighborhood. And I have these vivid memories of, going to bed at night and listening to Michelle's music. She would play a song by Patti LaBelle, If Only You Knew, really on a loop. And it drove my mom crazy. And I would hear her complaining with her friends about how something has to be done about Michelle. And I asked my older sister once, because she was my wise older sister. She's not much older than me. I must have been about 5. And she said to me, Michelle's a crackhead. That is the problem. That is what the whole fuss is about, is that our neighbor is a crackhead and they're trying to figure out what to do about her. And it was just so shocking to me as a kid that I lived, near someone who was this character that people talked about. And I would see on Sundays an older woman who kind of looked like Michelle and a little girl that kind of looked like Michelle, that they would come to her house, dressed in their Sunday's best. And my sister explained to me that was Michelle's mom and daughter. And I was, gobsmacked that a crackhead could have a mom and daughter. And, as I grew up, I think what really stuck with me was this idea that these vilified people were people, that they were like a part of our community and that they had families. And I really wanted to understand who they were as people, underneath all of the stuff that was kind of hurled onto them. So to your question, what I realized in reporting the book and talking to Lenny. Lenny is a woman who was addicted to crack for decades in South Central Los Angeles, who's now in recovery, who I found through her recovery work, who just explained to me how, being a woman, being a black woman, and being an addict made her basically a non-person in society. That, there was a decade during which people, only spoke to her at a distance, literally, out of arm's reach, because she was just this untouchable. And, people didn't know her, but they had a lot of ideas about her because of, this character that she inhabited. So, through the book, I profile really what Lenny's life was like growing up, really unprotected and experiencing a lot of traumatic stuff as a young black woman in South Central LA, and how really the only thing that she had to comfort herself was crack. It was the only thing really accessible to her, and she embraced it. And she's just this great, vivacious character who I think of as the girl that just stayed at the party too long. That some people were able to experiment with drugs and kind of get out, but she wasn't able to do that, and it completely derailed her life for a very long period.
As a reader, when you're reading these stories, you get to know the characters and you get invested in their lives, and I left the book thinking about, you tell the story of your neighbor, but you chronicle Lenny's life, but it's like there are just millions of these stories over and over again. And one of the most sad and frustrating and maddening parts too is at the same time you chronicle how the quote-unquote war on drugs just kept getting re-upped, to pun mildly intended, by the government over and over again, while at the same time it was clear that what they were doing was actually minimally effective in preventing drugs from getting into the hands of, getting into communities who were racked by them, if that was their intended goal at all. So can you talk a little bit about just like this discrepancy between government policy just continuing to go harder and harder in the war on drugs in the 80s and into the 90s, while at the same time people like Kurt Schmoke, another character in your book, who is the becomes the mayor of Baltimore, how they seem to know that there were other ways of targeting drug use that were just ignored and fell by the wayside.
Yeah. The story of drug policy in this country is really about fear mongering and doing the expedient. So the fear mongering is an effective tactic for politicians to get elected. No one likes a drug addict, no one likes a drug dealer, so it's very easy to campaign on. And very few people understand addiction. So when you propose something expedient like just locking people up, that seems like an effective policy, no matter how expensive it is. And it's something that the public embraces, especially at a time when the country was more conservative, when I would say the country was, it's hard to sort of gauge how racially divided America's ever been, but I would say at a pretty pronounced period of racial division,
Right.
where there was still a lot of lingering animosity from the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and the riots of the 1960s and 70s, that there was this idea that people in so-called inner cities, which inner cities is one of these terms that we grew up with, that now that I'm older, I realize is really nonsensical doublespeak, that it assumes that the average person lives in a suburb, in that
Yeah.
cities are this nether region and not sort of the heart of our country is American cities. But it's language that sort of signifies the perspective. So this idea that people in inner cities were just destroying the country and needed to be dealt with. So we got a very expensive dragnet that put billions of dollars into policing to build up police departments to be the sort of machines that they are today, sort of paramilitary, essentially, right? And that happens not because of local budgets, because of funding from the federal government that routes federal dollars into local police departments, that gives them military equipment as ways of fighting the war on drugs. So you see the rise of things like SWAT, and you see people like Police Chief Daryl Gates and from the LAPD using tanks to bust down the doors of alleged crack houses. So that is a part of the response that is ineffective, and you see very little investment in addiction as a public health issue. That Kurt Schmoke, who was mayor of Baltimore, the first black elected mayor of Baltimore, he gets into office in his late 30s, and very early on in his tenure as mayor, he's asked to testify before Congress about the issue of drugs, because Baltimore was having a really hard time with both heroin and with crack. And him being sort of a brainy guy, he was married to a physician, he believed that addiction was a public health issue, and he proposed decriminalizing drugs as a way of eliminating the drug economy, and then finding ways to treat addicts as people who were sick. And he thought that Baltimore could really pilot a program that, with all the resources they had in Johns Hopkins and other hospitals, that they could teach other cities how to do harm reduction programs and how to do recovery programs. And he was laughed out of those congressional hearings by the likes of Marion Barry, who sort of made a point to talk about how naive Kurt Schmoke was. Coincidentally, Marion Barry would be arrested for crack cocaine possession a few years later in a pretty infamous sting. But Kurt Schmoke's position was so unpopular that it really ruined any chance that he had for higher office. And he was reelected mayor of Baltimore for a few additional terms. But it really hung over his entire administration. This idea that he was this naive guy that thought that addiction was a public health issue and not a criminal issue. I should say, though, that Kurt Schmoke also had been a prosecutor. So, he wasn't coming in from a completely naive point, that he had seen the extent to which the crack epidemic was a problem of dealers and this really lucrative but violent drug trade that created lots of chaos in American cities, and that really required a level of investment in policing that many cities were not equipped to actually provide. So that was on one hand, and on the other hand, the drug epidemic was about addiction and about getting people into recovery. And instead of seeing it as we'll just arrest our way out of it, he thought that there were other solutions. His approach, I think, today is much more accepted. It's not always applied, but I think that people don't laugh at Kurt Schmoke anymore.
Yeah. He does not seem. It does not seem a character to be laughed at, and he, as you also mentioned, his story gets wrapped or gets covered a little bit in the HBO show The Wire, which is interesting too. May I ask you one last question, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And I'll mention that alongside this investment in law enforcement and arresting the government thinking they can arrest their way out of the crack epidemic, mass incarceration begins in earnest. And there were 40,000 people incarcerated in 1980 for drug offenses, there were 489,000 incarcerated in 2013 for drug offenses. People of color absorbing much of that explosion disproportionately. And I also just want to mention too, because your book is so good, your chapter on conspiracy theories about the drug war and why the government invested so much in ineffective policies is fascinating, and I encourage people to read it. It has to do with Iran-Contra, which we've covered a bit before, and more. But just to skip forward a little bit, can you talk about how did the epidemic end? How has the epidemic in some ways not ended today for many people? And who was more responsible for helping people to see to get off of these drugs, Nancy Reagan or Dr. Dre?
It was not Nancy Reagan, I hate to say. As much as we no.
Yeah.
I won't even be fake about it.
Yeah.
Nancy Reagan is one of America's villains, but that the Just Say No campaign of the 80s, it turned out had very little effect on ending the crack epidemic. That what researchers from the Department of Justice, through a number of studies, have found is that the crack epidemic was a trend, just like any other trend. And in order for it to continue, it has to be taken up by subsequent cohorts. So, the original sort of crack generation, I would say, were people who were about 18 to 25 from around 1983 to about 1995. So that is where you see the users and the dealers. And the next generation of young people looked at the devastation in their communities, and they had conversations internally and interacted with the culture that was created around what was happening in their communities, namely hip hop, and decided to make a different decision. So the crack epidemic ends abruptly in the mid-90s because there are not new crack users. So then there's no need for crack dealers. One of the interesting things, so really we have young people to thank, really young people of color, to thank for ending the crack epidemic and all the misery that it brought. Young Black and Latino people still do not use rates of hard drugs, nearly at this, or don't use hard drugs like cocaine, like opioids, at the same rate as their white counterparts. And many people, or many scientists and researchers, believe that there is this protective effect, essentially it's kind of buffer from the crack epidemic that has kept those young people from re-engaging those substances. I will say that buffer effect is going away, sadly, that you're starting to see Black and Latino men now leading overdose deaths related to fentanyl. So I think that enough time has passed that people are starting to forget some of the devastation of the crack epidemic. And that was one of the reasons that I wrote the book, is I wanted to document how drug epidemics happen and really what their consequences are. But also I want to say, that you mentioned Dr. Dre, and I use him sort of as a stand-in for what was called gangster rap at the period, that really was a grassroots voice about what was happening with the crack epidemic, the violence, the sort of gang culture in places like LA, the tragedy of addiction. And even though, that period, there's a terrible record of misogyny and violence against women and a whole host of other, really awful things, that the messaging regarding drugs was very consistent. It was anti-crack in rap music. And Dr. Dre is so interesting because the crack epidemic sort of takes off around 1983. It plateaus in about 1990, where you see it reaches its peak in around 1990, where you see some of the worst violence of the period, and then it plateaus until about 1992, and then rates of things like cocaine-related arrests, cocaine overdoses, things like that really start to drop in 1992. And at the same time, there's this huge takeoff for young people in use of marijuana that same year. And I think that's so fascinating because it happens to be the year that that Dr. Dre dropped the Chronic.
Yeah,
when
I read that, I thought, wow, it's so surprising, but it also makes a lot of sense.
Researchers called the subsequent generation of young people the blunt generation, saying that you see a lot of references to blunts in the music at the same time that you see young people making the choice of marijuana being their first drug to use and also their drug of choice.
Yeah, I did not know. I could have told you, like, on a spiritual level, the influence that Dr. Dre had on me as a kid, but I didn't really know on more of a wide societal level the influence of the Chronic. I also just will add, I love when you specify, when you're like, his album's called The Chronic, and chronic is a term for it's like, but I guess
a good parenthetical explanation. For folks that don't know.
Of course. Well, I will. Excuse me. I don't want to take up more of your time, but I will say just a few, some concluding notes that you have. One is you warn readers about this history being able to replicate itself, and that is a very passive way of putting it, because in many ways, many of the individuals and entities that help spread the epidemic, and those that organized a draconian response merely for political gain, using your words, have yet to be held to account for many of those unjust policies and actions of the 80s and 90s. So there's a lot of work to be done toward healing and toward reversing injustice, as you mentioned. So that's one takeaway of yours. And another is that, if I may just quote you, another wonderful line, you write that Drugs like cocaine are addictive, mind-altering substances with the ability to shift cultures, generate fortunes, provoke hysteria, and disrupt communities. They are not, however, more powerful than the human spirit, hope, faith, second chances, the love and support of family, expressions of community care. So you leave us with these dual notions that seem to be in battle with each other, but give a lot of room for thought and for, I don't know, avoiding the mistakes of the past that we seem destined to repeat nonetheless.
Yeah.
But really, a fabulous book. Can't recommend it enough. And Donovan, thank you so much for your scholarship and for speaking with me about it today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben, and I would love to do it when I write another book, and it'll be much, much lighter fare. I promise.
Okay, I'll hold you to that.